Her hands knew the motion before her mind agreed to it. Fold the sleeve in, smooth the collar flat, lay the dress along the bottom of the trunk so the ride would not crease it. She had packed this same trunk 3 times now, and her hands no longer waited for her heart to catch up. Outside the boarding house window, Bitter Creek was doing what it always did at that hour, which was very little. A dog slept in the shade of the feed store. A wagon creaked past with a load of fence posts. Nobody out there knew yet that Eleanor Bishop was leaving again, though by supper the whole town would know, because towns that size always knew. 26 years old, she thought, closing the trunk lid slowly, deliberately, the way she did most things now. 26, and mailed back east 3 times already, like a coat that had never once been given the chance to fit. She did not cry over it anymore. That had stopped somewhere around the second return, when she understood that crying changed nothing about the letter she would carry, or the look on the face of the station master when he read her name off the passenger list, or the particular silence that fell over a room when a woman arrived somewhere already used. The first had been Wallace Pruitt, a wheat farmer near Laramie who wanted a wife the way he wanted a good mule, dependable and quiet, and asking nothing. When it became clear that Eleanor was hard of hearing in her left ear from a fever she had taken at 12, and that she sometimes answered a beat late or asked a man to face her when he spoke, Wallace decided she was simple. He sent her back with a note that said she was not suited to farm life, which was not true, and which they both knew was not true. The second had been Ezra Cobb, who kept sheep and a temper in roughly equal measure. Ezra did not mind her ear. Ezra minded that she would not agree with him simply because he raised his voice, and that when he was wrong she told him so, plainly, the way her father had taught her to speak. Ezra called it insolence. He sent her back inside of 2 months. The third had been Daniel Voss, a decent enough man who had simply changed his mind, the way some men did, and who had the grace at least to say so honestly instead of inventing a fault in her. That one had hurt the least and the most at the same time, because there had been nothing wrong to fix. 3 times the Cheyenne Matrimonial Bureau had matched her westward. 3 times she had come back to the front parlor belonging to Mrs. Colfax with her trunk and her particular quiet, and 3 times Mrs. Colfax had looked at her with a pity that Eleanor had grown to hate more than any unkindness a husband had ever shown her. She had asked Mrs. Colfax once, after the 3rd return, whether it might simply be kinder to stop trying altogether, to take a position as a housekeeper somewhere, and let the matter of marriage rest. Mrs. Colfax had looked at her over the rim of her spectacles for a long moment before answering. "It is not kindness to let a good woman believe she is unwantable simply because 3 men proved unequal to her," Mrs. Colfax had said. "It is only surrender, and I have never once seen surrender fix anything worth fixing." Eleanor had not fully believed her at the time. She believed her a little more now, standing in the front parlor with her trunk beside her, listening to Mrs. Colfax read out the particulars of a 4th arrangement in that same brisk, unbothered voice, as though a 4th chance were the most ordinary thing in the world instead of the last one Eleanor privately suspected she had left in her. There was a 4th match now. A rancher named Thomas Renner, up near Bitter Creek in the northern part of the territory, a widower with land and no children, and a reputation, according to Mrs. Colfax, for being a man of few words and fewer complaints. Mrs. Colfax had written him the particulars, as she always did before sending a woman a 3rd or 4th time, so that no man could later claim he had been misled. Eleanor did not know what the particulars said this time. She only knew that somewhere on a train headed north, a sealed letter with her name folded inside it was traveling ahead of her, the way it always did, arriving in the hands of a stranger before she ever arrived in his sight. The train ride took the better part of 2 days, and Eleanor spent most of it watching the land change outside the window, the soft green of the eastern counties giving way to something wider and harder and less forgiving. Wyoming Territory did not pretend to be gentle. She found she liked that honesty in it. At Bitter Creek, the platform was small, and the wind was constant, tugging at her hat as she stepped down with her trunk in both hands, refusing help from the porter out of a stubbornness that had outlived every man who had tried to cure her of it. A man stood near the station house, tall, sun-weathered, his hat pushed back enough to show pale eyes that did not move away from her the way most men did when they first saw her face and searched it for whatever fault they had been warned about. He came forward, and took the trunk from her hands without asking, and without making a show of asking either. He simply lifted it, the way a man lifts something that is his to carry now. "I am Thomas Renner," he said. "Folks call me Tom." "Eleanor Bishop," she answered, and watched his mouth as he spoke the way she had trained herself to do since the fever took the hearing from her left side, reading the shapes of words as much as hearing them. He noticed her watching his mouth. Most men either pretended not to notice or made some comment about it. Tom did neither. He simply turned his face a little more toward her when he spoke next, angling himself so she would have an easier time of it, and said nothing at all about why he had done it. That was the first small thing. It was not a kindness with words attached. It was a kindness with no words attached at all, which Eleanor had learned to trust far more. The wagon ride out to the ranch took the better part of an hour, and they spoke little of it, which suited Eleanor. She had grown tired of husbands who filled silence with talk that meant nothing. Tom drove with the reins loose in his hands and let the country speak instead, the grass rolling gold under a sky that seemed to go on longer than sky had any right to. At the station house behind them, in the pocket of the coat Tom wore, wrote a letter with the careful hand of Mrs. Colfax on the outside of it. He had been given it by the station master, along with a bundle of feed store correspondence, and he had folded it into his coat without opening it, because a mare had gone lame that morning and there had not been time, and because he had never much cared for reading the opinion of another man of a woman before he had formed his own. He did not think of it again that day. It stayed folded in the coat, which he hung on a peg by the kitchen door that evening, and there it remained. The ranch house was modest but sound, a good roof and a swept porch and a garden gone to weed. Since, Tom admitted without embarrassment, his wife had died 2 winters back, and he had never been much good at growing things himself. Eleanor looked at the tangled garden the way another woman might have looked at a ballroom. "I can bring that back," she said. He looked at her for a moment, the way a man looks at someone who has said a plain thing plainly, without flourish, and simply nodded. "Reckon you can," he said. The first weeks at the Renner Ranch fell into a rhythm that Eleanor had never quite known before. There was work, real work, from before the sun came fully up until after it had gone fully down, but it was work that answered her, that showed itself finished at the end of a day in a way that pleasing a difficult husband never had. She turned the garden first, breaking the hard soil with a spade nobody had oiled in 2 years, pulling weeds until her hands blistered and then calloused, and then simply knew the work. Within 3 weeks there were rows of beans climbing string and squash spreading wide green leaves and a scent of turned earth in the mornings that had not been there before. She took to the animals next, without being asked. There was a horse in the far pen that the hired hands avoided, a big raw-boned gelding named Duke that had thrown 2 men and earned a reputation for meanness that Eleanor did not entirely believe. She watched him for 3 days before she ever went near him, standing at the fence in the evenings, learning the particular way he held his ears and shifted his weight. On the 4th day, she went into the pen alone. Tom found her there an hour later, standing quiet with her hand flat against the shoulder of Duke while the horse stood still as a fence post, and he did not call out or startle her, only leaned against the rail and watched. "He is not mean," Eleanor said without turning. "He is deaf in his right ear. Something spooks him from that side before he has time to place it, and then he does what any creature does when it is frightened and cannot understand why." Tom was quiet a long moment. "How did you know that?" he asked. "Because I know what it is to have people call you difficult, when the truth is only that the world reaches you a little differently than it reaches them," Eleanor said. She had not meant to say so much. It was the kind of honesty she usually kept folded away, the way Mrs. Colfax folded her particulars into envelopes. But something about the quiet of the pen and the hoarse breathing, steady under her hand, and a man who had not once flinched at anything about her, loosened it out of her before she thought better of it. Tom did not say anything clever back to her. He did not offer sympathy she had not asked for. He only nodded slowly, the way he nodded at most things, and said, "Well, he's lucky somebody finally figured that out." There was another creature on the place that autumn who had never much trusted anyone, a barn cat gone half wild after the previous mistress of the house had died, a thin gray animal that lived in the loft and came down only at night to eat scraps left near the door and vanish again before morning. The hired hands called her a nuisance. Eleanor called her patient and began leaving a little more than scraps and sitting near the barn door in the evenings with her sewing, saying nothing, simply being present until the cat learned that presence did not always mean danger. It took the better part of a month before the animal came close enough to be touched, and when it finally did, curling itself once against her ankle in the lamplight and then retreating up the ladder as quick as it had come, Eleanor felt something in her own chest loosen that she had not expected a barn cat to loosen. She understood that creature. She understood what it was to have learned caution the hard way and to test, slow and careful, whether a new place might finally be safe. That night at supper, over beans from her own garden and bread she had baked in a stove that still ran hot on the left side and cool on the right, Eleanor told him plainly about her hearing, the way she had learned to tell every new household before someone else told them wrong. She explained about the fever at 12 and the left ear that had never come back and the habit she had of watching a mouth as much as listening to a voice. Tom listened all the way through without interrupting, and when she finished, he only asked her to sit on his right side from then on at the table so that her good ear would face the room instead of the wall. It was such a small adjustment, and he made it as though it cost him nothing at all, which somehow made it worth more than any grand promise the first 3 men had made her before they broke it. It was somewhere in that second week that Eleanor found the letter. She had not gone looking for it. She had only been hanging the coat Tom wore back on its peg after brushing the trail dust from it, and the corner of an envelope had shown itself from the inside pocket, her own name written across the front of it in the careful slanting hand of Mrs. Colfax. Miss Eleanor Bishop, particulars enclosed, still sealed. She stood in the kitchen a long moment with the coat in her hands, and something cold moved through her chest. The old familiar dread of a husband who was only waiting for the right moment to read the worst of her and act accordingly. She had seen this before, in the house of Wallace and in that of Ezra. A letter kept close, read in private, and then a change in the weather of a marriage that she was never given the reason for until it was already ending. She hung the coat back on its peg exactly as she had found it, the letter still tucked inside, still sealed, and she said nothing to Tom about having seen it. There did not seem to be a way to ask a man why he was keeping something without also asking him what he already knew, and some nights she was not ready to hear the answer to that. She told herself it did not matter. She told herself this 3 times over the following weeks, and it was mostly true during the daylight hours when there was work enough to keep the thought from settling. It was less true at night, lying awake in the small room off the kitchen that had been given to her, listening with her good ear turned toward the wall. Autumn came on hard and early that year. The garden gave its last good harvest, and Eleanor spent 2 days putting up beans and squash in jars along the pantry shelf, working alongside a woman named Sarah Voss, who kept house 2 ranches over and had become, in the quiet way of frontier women, something like a friend. It was Sarah who told her that Ezra Cobb had come north. "He's buying stock up near the county line," Sarah said, not looking up from the jar she was sealing. "Heard he has been talking in the mercantile. Talking about you, Eleanor." The hands of Eleanor went still over the jar she was filling. "What is he saying?" she asked. The mouth of Sarah pressed thin. "That you are difficult, that you argue with a man until he has no peace in his own house, that Tom Renner does not know what he has taken on." Eleanor said nothing for a while. The old shame rose in her, familiar as an ache in a bone that had broken once and never quite forgotten how. "He's not wrong that I argue," she said finally. "I argue when a man is wrong and will not say so. I have never once argued to be cruel." "I know that," Sarah said. "Question is whether Ezra Cobb will find his way to Tom before Tom finds his way past whatever Ezra says." 2 days later, Ezra Cobb rode onto the Renner ranch himself. Eleanor was in the garden when she heard the horse, and she straightened in time to see Ezra dismount near the porch where Tom stood mending a bridle. Ezra was a heavy-set man with a temper that showed itself first in his shoulders, and it showed itself now, hunched forward as he crossed the yard. "Renner," Ezra said, loud enough to carry to the garden, "word is you took my old wife off the hands of Colfax." Tom set the bridle down slow and deliberate, the way a man sets something down when he means to have both hands free. "She is not your wife," Tom said. "Has not been for the better part of a year." The mouth of Ezra twisted. "I am doing you a kindness, coming out here. That woman is trouble." Talks back to a man like she was raised to it, cold as a well in winter, no matter how a man tries with her. Eleanor stood at the edge of the garden with a basket of squash in her arms, close enough now to hear every word, and old instinct told her to disappear back among the rows the way she once might have, to let the men settle it between them, the way men like to believe things got settled. She did not move. "I read your letter before I sent her back to Colfax," Ezra went on. "Told the truth of it, too. Woman cannot hear half of what a man says to her, and argues with the half she does hear." There it was. Confirmation, at last, of what Eleanor had feared for weeks, that the particulars Mrs. Colfax wrote were not neutral facts, but a collection of grievances from men who had wanted an easy thing and been given, instead, a real one. The face of Tom did not change the way Eleanor expected it to. There was no doubt crossing it, no reconsideration. There was only a stillness that she recognized now as the same stillness he had shown her that first day at the station, the stillness of a man deciding something and meaning to hold to it. "I never read your letter," Tom said, "nor the one from Wallace Pruitt, nor whatever Voss might have written either. I got the particulars from Colfax the day the train carrying Eleanor came in, and I put it in my coat pocket, and there it has stayed." Ezra blinked, thrown for the first time since he had ridden in. "You never read it," he repeated. "Did not need to," Tom said. "I've known the woman 3 months now. I know she can hear a storm coming off the mountains an hour before I can. I know she talked a horse everybody else called ruined into eating out of her hand inside a week. I know she does not say a thing she does not mean, which is more than I can say for most men I have met, including the one standing in my yard right now." At that moment, Duke, still skittish from strange voices and unfamiliar shapes at the edge of his pasture, threw his head and began to circle hard against the far rail, spooked by the raised voice of Ezra carrying on the wind toward his blind side. Eleanor set the basket down without a word and crossed the yard past both men, climbing the rail and going to the head of the horse, speaking low and steady, her hand finding his cheek, turning his good ear toward her voice until the circling slowed and then stopped. She did it without hurry, without looking to see whether either man was watching, because it was not for them, it was for the horse. But they watched anyway. Ezra watched a woman he had called cold and difficult calm a horse that grown men could not go near, and something in his certainty seemed to falter, the way certainty does when the world simply refuses to agree with it in plain sight. Tom watched too, though he had seen it before. He watched the way a man watches something he already knows the value of, needing no convincing. "You can see yourself off my land, Ezra," Tom said, quiet now, all the heat gone out of his voice and something harder settled in underneath it. "And you can tell whoever is still listening in that mercantile that Eleanor Bishop is spoken for, and spoken for well, and that the men who sent her back were not disappointed in her. They were simply not equal to her." Ezra had no answer for that. He mounted up in the stiff, wounded silence of a man who has lost an argument he did not know he had started, and rode off the way he had come, and did not come back. That evening, after the animals were settled and the last light had gone soft and gold over the western ridge, Tom went to the peg by the kitchen door and took his coat down. Eleanor watched from the table, her hands still, as he reached into the inside pocket and drew out the letter, still sealed, the careful hand of Mrs. Colfax still steady across the front of it. He set it on the table between them. "I ought to have told you it was here," he said. "Did not seem important at the time. Then it seemed like something I did not want to give power to by opening it. Now I reckon it belongs to you more than it belongs to me anyway." Eleanor looked at the letter a long moment. 3 months of wondering what it said, of half expecting some quiet reckoning to come from it the way it always had before, and here it sat, unopened, offered back to her like something that had never really been his to keep secret in the first place. She broke the seal herself. Inside, in the neat hand of Mrs. Colfax, were the particulars, as promised. A note about her hearing, plainly stated, not unkindly. A note that she was direct in speech and did not flatter where flattery was not earned. A note at the very bottom in a softer hand than the rest that read, "This woman has been returned 3 times through no true fault of her own, and any man fortunate enough to keep her will have kept the best of what this bureau has ever placed." Eleanor read it twice, and then set it down on the table, and found that her eyes had gone wet in a way they had not since the second return, when she had still believed crying might change something. Tom did not reach for the letter. He reached for her hand instead, resting on the table beside it, and simply held it, saying nothing, letting the fire crack and settle in the stove behind them. "I did not need to read it to know what was in it," he said finally. "I only needed to watch you 3 months." He took the letter up then, folded it once and crossed to the stove and fed it into the flame without ceremony, the way a man discards something that has already done whatever good it was going to do and has no further use. The paper caught and curled and went to ash behind the grate, and neither of them watched it long. Winter came on in earnest not long after, the first hard snow arriving early and settling deep across the valley. And Bitter Creek gathered itself the way frontier towns did when the season turned, drawing its scattered families in toward the schoolhouse for the December social, the one gathering of the year nobody stayed home from if they could help it. Eleanor had not wanted to go at first. 3 months was not so long, and old habits of expecting a room to turn cold around her did not unlearn themselves easily. But Tom asked her plainly, the way he asked most things, and she found she trusted his plainness more than her own doubt. The schoolhouse was warm with bodies and lantern light when they arrived, fiddle music already going, and Eleanor felt the old instinct rise in her, the instinct to find a corner and make herself small and wait for the evening to prove her right about herself. Sarah Voss found her first, pulling her toward the food tables with the easy claim of a friend who had decided the matter was settled. And then, one by one, other women of the valley came to speak with her, about the garden everyone had heard she had brought back from ruin, about the horse called Duke that half the county had written off, about small kindnesses word travels faster than shame in a place small enough to know its own business. Even the thin gray barn cat had grown bold enough by then to follow Eleanor as far as the porch some mornings, waiting there while she fed the chickens. And Tom had taken to calling the animal the second horse belonging to Eleanor, since between the two of them there did not seem to be a creature on the ranch left ungentled. It made Eleanor laugh, an easy, unguarded sound she noticed had come more often that winter than in all the years before it combined. Nobody in that room treated her like a woman who had been sent back 3 times. They treated her like a woman Tom Renner had chosen and kept, which, she understood now, was the truth that mattered, and the only one anybody there had any real use for. Tom found her near the end of the evening, standing at the edge of the room with a cup of cider warming her hands, and he did not say anything grand. He only stood beside her a while, watching the dancing, and then said, quiet enough that only her good ear caught it, "You are not going anywhere, Eleanor. I want you to hear that plain, so there's no wondering over it later." "I hear you plain," she said. "Both ears are not." He almost smiled at that, the closest thing to a laugh she had gotten out of him yet. And it was enough. They walked home together, under a sky gone hard and bright with winter stars, the wagon wheels creaking soft over packed snow, and Eleanor thought of the garden waiting under its blanket of white, ready to be broken open again come spring, and of Duke standing steady in his pen now, no longer flinching at sounds from his blind side, because he had learned, finally, that nothing coming from that direction meant him harm. She thought of 3 trunks packed 3 times over, 3 trains carrying her east again, with nothing gained and nothing kept. And she thought of the ash behind the stove grate, all that anyone had ever written down about her faults, gone now to nothing, weighing on no one. Come spring, when the frost finally broke and the ground softened enough to work, Eleanor went back out to the garden with the same spade she had used the autumn before, and found that the rows she had dug still held their shape beneath the melting snow, waiting for her the way nothing had ever quite waited for her before. She knelt in the cold, wet earth and pressed her palm flat against it, and felt no dread in the feel of soil under her hand, only the plain, steady promise of a season that intended to see her all the way through it. Tom came out to find her there, and did not ask why she knelt so long in the mud, only crouched down beside her and turned over a handful of the same earth, working it between his fingers the way a man tests whether a thing is ready. "Beans again?" he asked. "Beans again," she said, "and squash. And this year I mean to try corn along the north fence if you will build me the rows for it. I will build you whatever rows you ask for," he said, and there was no flourish in the saying of it, only the same plain certainty he had carried since the day he lifted her trunk off the station platform without being asked. She had come to Bitter Creek as a woman other men had returned, unwanted goods passed hand to hand with a note attached explaining the defect. She sat now beside a man who had never once needed the note, who had built his understanding of her the slow way, the true way, out of 100 small mornings and 100 small evenings, none of them grand, all of them honest. That, she thought, watching the lantern light of the ranch house come into view across the white field, was the whole of what she had ever wanted, and the thing every returned woman quietly believes she will never be given again. Not to be chosen loudly, only to be kept plainly by someone who never needed a warning to know her worth, because he had simply taken the time to see it for himself.